Hi, I'm Joseph Clemens, and I'm an archaeologist that was part of a team excavating here at the Forgeman's house in 2015. And we made a lot of exciting discoveries in 2015 during the course of excavations, and one of the things I want to touch on today is about artifacts that were found within the house itself and not just within the soil beneath the floorboards and around the house. So one of the things that's interesting about conducting this type of archaeology is it gives us an example of how to look at an archaeological site, not just in what is buried, but also what is contained within a structure, and how those artifacts within a structure can tell us and inform us about people who may not have had a voice in the historical narrative. And that's what's really important about archaeology, is kind of constructing narratives around the artifacts that we find that relate to people that don't show up much in the historical record, such as the common worker here at the furnace, or possibly children that would have been living here within the Forgeman's house. So when we first started excavations, we noticed that during the removal of some of the boards around the roof area of the house, that there was some clothing and other pieces of cloth sticking out of the eaves. And upon further inspection and removal of some of this clothing that was sticking out, we realized that it had quite a bit of age to it, and that it had been placed where the stone foundation met the roof line. In some instances, it was just shoved in, and in some instances, it had been twisted and shoved in and covered in whitewash. And what that tells us is that they were using these clothes, these rags, flour sacks, and newspapers as a form of insulation to kind of block off the drafts that would come in from under the roof line. And what's important about these clothes is that it's over 100 items of clothing that we can identify that really gives us a snapshot into the life of the average worker, what they'd be wearing, how they wore it. For example, one of the things that often doesn't make it in historical clothing collections is underwear. This is a pair of breeches, or underdrawers, from the late 19th century. As you can see, we have traces of whitewash here from when I removed them. We also have a crosser button, which bears evidence of whitewash as well. Now, they look like rags, and in effect, they were used like rags. They were shoved in for insulation. But certain things about the clothing, from the thread, from the buttons, from the style, can inform us about its age. And the wear patterns, such as here on the knees, can inform us about how this article of clothing was used. Where were the spots that they were wearing the most? Do wear spots in clothing correlate to a possible job that somebody was doing? You know, if you're out in the garden all day, you tend to wear out the knees of your pants because you're constantly down picking various fruits and vegetables and working the soil. So different types of labor can leave different types of wear patterns on clothing, which can inform us about the duties that some of these people would be performing. It's also important to remember that it's not just the clothing that was found up here in the eaves. It's also things like newspaper. The photograph that is spread around in the news article that shows me removing the clothing and other items from the house is actually when I'm removing flour sacks here from the south fascia of the house. I was climbing the ladder and removing flour sacks and newspapers from the outside. Most of the clothing was recovered by going inside the house and pulling it out here through this room, whereas much of the newspaper had been shoved in from the outside in and was a little bit later date, which can tell us that they replaced the fascia boards on the front and were using whatever they had on hand, local flour sacks from local mills, or wadded up newspaper to provide insulation. And one of the more exciting finds that we had while we were recovering all of these artifacts came here from the southeast corner, which has now been done over in the remodeling that has happened since. But within the southeast corner, at the very apex of the corner of the house in the foundation, we found a tight grouping of artifacts, some of which included bits of string and clothing, but also a pack of playing cards. Notice there's no numbers. This is before they put the numbers on the playing cards. You had to count when you were playing poker. As well as a well-preserved tobacco brick. And this is how tobacco would have been commonly sold many times. And you can see it's just compressed tobacco in a block. And you would cut this off, and you could cut it off as pipe tobacco, you could cut it off as chewing tobacco. It's not quite the standard twist plug that some people may be familiar with, but it was a very typical form of tobacco preservation and sale. So what does this little stash of artifacts tell us? As opposed to the clothing, which was widespread and obviously used as an insulation roll, this stash of artifacts could tell us a different story. This could tell us a little bit about the person who maybe put them there. It's an interesting collection of items. You have tobacco, playing cards, and also, interestingly, an advertisement for a catalog from 1897. Now, within this advertisement, which was carefully folded up and stored with the playing cards and tobacco, we see a section for a metal comb that you can purchase, along with proof of purchase of the flour that this advertisement came with. Now, what's interesting about that is it ties the artifacts that we find within the house and the roof to the artifacts that we find in the soil. Near the fireplace, that style comb was recovered. It's a folding metal comb, and it looks exactly like the advertisement. So could whoever put this collection of items here in the southeast corner of the house have actually followed through with their carefully folded catalog of things they wanted and bought this comb and then later lost it down through cracks in the floor? We don't know for sure, but it does provide us good evidence that there's a direct tie between not only the artifacts that are up here in this part of the house and the artifacts that are down below and buried beneath the floorboards that we excavated, but to the people that lived here and the stories that they have to tell us yet with the artifacts that we found. So much of the clothing that was recovered came from the sides of the house, whereas much of the flour sacks and newspapers that were recovered, mostly dating to the later 19th century, came from the eaves during the removal and replacement of the fascia boards here at the gable ends of the house. So it's important to note that it's not just the artifacts that archaeologists uncover within the soil that tell a story about a people and about a narrative. It's also the artifacts that we can recover from within structures and the structures themselves, which tell their own stories about the people that built them. So, for instance, here at the Forgeman's house, with the clothing that we recovered and the detailed historical analysis we did during the renovation of the structure, we're allowed to strengthen archaeology. And it gives us this unique opportunity to not only pull from artifacts, both below and above the surface, but also from oral histories, local narratives, and historical research and photographs that kind of give us a more complete picture of history and what happened here at Catoctin Furnace.